Well, hello, everybody. My name is Chris Southworth. As Vashti's already introduced, a little bit more about me tomorrow, where I'll be doing a full session on regulatory frameworks and standards toolkits for cross-border trade. Can I just confirm whether we have Felicity on the line? Do we know if she's with us in the session? Yeah, John's on. John is on. Hi, John.
Hi. Morning, everyone.
Brilliant. Well, while we're waiting to see if Felicity's with us, let's just start off with John and Warrick, if I can. So we're just going to talk broadly about fintech, sandboxing, sorry, not sandbag, sandboxing. Too much time on the beach yesterday, I think. What are these terms? Because I think sometimes they get used very loosely, and it's not always entirely clear what we mean by either. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time just trying to define those, and then talk a little bit about the sort of regulatory environment around, particularly around the sort of fintech's finance and what that means for B2C and B2B in terms of cross-border trade, which is where I come from. So I'm just going to, before we get started, just ask Warrick and John just to introduce themselves. If I can come to you, John, first on the screen. Can you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what your interests are for this session.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to start off. I think it was very unfair for this panel to have to follow Regan Adgarali with his energetic presentation, but hopefully we could maintain that. Hello to all the persons attending. Sorry I couldn't make it in person. So I am John Outridge, the Chief Executive Officer of the Trinidad and Tobago International Finance Center. And basically, we are a government state agency under the Ministry of Finance. And our objectives is really about pushing Trinidad and Tobago towards a cashless society. And we are sort of executing on that plan by sort of focusing on three core objectives that are basically related. Accelerating the digitalization of payments across the public sector, working to increase the financial inclusion levels within society, so really focusing on the unbanked and the underbanked. And then by pushing those two objectives, one of the sort of realities we were faced with is we realized that there's an absolute need, and I guess this panel will sort of address it in terms of having fintech really play a sort of key role in terms of providing the capabilities for the traditional finance sector, but also at the same time, what I would call designing the experiences and the applications and the interfaces for the citizens and for customers to really use these solutions, to really see it as a sort of shared objective.
Thanks very much, John. And Warrick, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this session, which I think is a quite important session given, where digital economy is going. We heard this morning about financial inclusion. I think is very relevant to our side of the world and our countries that are represented here. My name obviously is Warrick Ward, the Chief Executive Officer of the Financial Services Commission. This is day 18 of my recent sojourn at the FSC. I've re-entered the fray there, and I think that we are the non-bank regulator, meaning along with the central bank, we are responsible for ensuring the regulation of the entire financial system in Barbados. So with that, I would just like to leave it to the questions and our discussion to learn a little bit more about what we are doing with fintech. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Warrick. John, if I can come to you with the first question, can you just explain what do you mean by fintechs? What does that actually mean? Are we talking about B2C here? Are we talking about B2B, business to business, or are we talking about all of it? Or where are the parameters around that term?
Yeah, that's a good question. And from being at the IFC just over a year now, when traditionally when you heard about fintech, typically, as it relates to not just even Caribbean wide, but globally, you were largely talking about payments, right? You were largely talking about peer-to-peer type payments and so forth. But in the work that we have been doing, we realize that the term fintech has actually sort of expanded a lot more. So, when I say fintech, I am talking about basically where we have seen, even I would say what I'm sort of observing regionally, where you had traditional technology companies, ICT companies sort of pivoting to really provide what I would call consumer-facing, customer-facing type applications sitting on top of your sort of core banking, sitting on top, leveraging the rails of the Visas and the MasterCards and so forth. So fintech basically, from what I'm seeing, is really sort of expanded to providing what I would call the rails between the financial sector and your sort of citizen, business, and government and the various use cases.
Yeah, I think it's quite a complex growing space, isn't it? Certainly in the trade environment over the last 5 years, we've seen fintechs play almost a zero role in trade finance delivery to a 20 to 30% of all trade finance delivery. Now the large trade banks, biggest in the world, are now seriously talking about disintermediation completely because of the role of fintech. It's incredibly, really important kind of space. To my next term, Warrick, can I come to you?
Sure.
I'll get it right this time. Sandboxing.
Sandbox, not sandbagging.
Not sandbagging. Sandboxing, what do we mean by that? Because that's another one that gets thrown around a lot.
Sure. I mean, if you think about what is a sandbox traditionally, it is basically a space that you set out for your kids to play in, where they will be monitored. They'll make sure that nothing happens. You can see what they're doing and that they don't wander off outside of your view. So you think of that as, for the fintech, the sandbox is really a space, a remote space that has been set up for new and emerging technologies, where the regulator might not be, totally au fait of these complex, how they work. And so you want to make sure that they're in a remote space where they don't pose a risk to the system or to the consumers. And it also allows for, within a live space, it allows for the feedback to these new entities or these innovative entities. And so that once you're sure, or you have some sort of comfort that they don't pose a risk to the system, then you can allow them to operate within the system freely. So basically, it's just a remote space where they can be observed, the new technologies could be observed, and also that you're aware of the types of risk that are in place within a live environment.
Spaces to play, I like that. That's great. Innovation is obviously a big part of this. John, can I come to you? In terms of success, what does success look like for you in 2 to 3 years? And if I can sort of double up on that question, where are you looking for best practice? What sort of lessons are you drawing from, and where are you drawing them from?
Sure. And, it's where, if I had to look at it, it's not only a sort of Trinidad and Tobago challenge, right? It's a regional challenge. It's one of the things that we are doing at the TTIFC, because when you look across the region, I believe our problems are largely the same, right? There is a huge challenge when it comes to having effective strategies, capabilities to deal with the unbanked and the underbanked, right? I believe it's the same across all the way up to Bahamas, right? You simply don't have the uptake of these sorts of technologies. And when you think about it, in recent times, the Caribbean, the region has been leading in a lot of ways globally in terms of, the Bahamas and even in the OACS launching CBDC pilots, right? And I believe they are at the phase right now where they're sort of reevaluating, looking at the uptake, looking to how to expand on it, right? But I'm not telling tales out of school, but I don't think the uptake has been sort of phenomenal, right? And again, it goes back to the fundamental sort of core hypothesis, right? And this is when we talk about fintech, right? What it is exactly we are trying to solve within the region, right? We know cash is a big issue. We understand the challenges we have in terms of the European Union, the OECD ratings and so forth. We understand, the FATF and the counter-terrorism financing aspects that cash sort of leads to the shadow economy and so forth. So if I had to look in the next 2 to 3 years, and again, when you look at the fintech ecosystem, there was recently a convention that took place in Barbados last year, I believe, late last year, called Fintech Islands. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it then, but I was remarking to someone that if that conference happened a year ago, you'd probably have 5 people in the room. But that conference had over 200 people attending, and you had a large contingent of what I call fintech companies within the region, the Island Pays, the We Pays, the PAYs. You had a lot of fintech entities showing up, all doing work penny pinch. Every Caribbean island had a fintech representative attending that conference, and they all working at providing what I would call solutions, use cases to dealing with that unbanked aspect of it. So if I had to look 2-3 years from now, I definitely think the Caribbean is a vibrant market for incubating fintech because of the fact that we have this large challenge of the unbanked, and there's clearly a disconnect with how people see their relationships with what I call the traditional financial institutions. And I do believe that the fintech revolution is really going to help the Caribbean and the banking sector sort of deal and increase the levels of financial inclusion.
Thanks very much, John. And Warrick, if I can come to you, this idea of fintech islands, I like that too. How do we kind of foster this fintech community across an island network, for one, or you could actually replicate that across any global region, in fact? How do we do that? How do we scale solutions, ideas? You and I were talking slightly before that, there's a big governance gap at times between where the private sector is and where government regulations are and laws are often far, far behind, in some cases, way back to the 1800s. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So how do we foster a legal policy environment in order for this to flourish?
Yeah, I mean, I like that question, and I actually listened to Helen's presentation this morning, which was quite a good presentation. And if you remember, the Attorney General, he spoke about a piece of legislation that we worked on. I was also on that committee way back in 2000, and none of the banks were interested. As we just heard, you didn't see any sort of uptake or urgency towards dealing with e-banking or e-commerce. Within the past 5 years, 6 years, we have seen this exponential growth. And I have to think about, the legal principles around any type of regulation, especially as it deals with fintech. Necessity. Is it necessary that we have, what type of regulation? Is it necessary to be regulated? For us, obviously, yes, because we have to think about the systemic risk, and we also have to think about those same individuals or consumers who are, we are catering for in terms of financial inclusion. They're usually the ones that are affected most whenever there's a crisis or something happens within the industry. Proportionality. This is where you tend to have a little challenge. Is the effort that is being made by the regulator, is it proportional to the risk? And once we're able to get that done correctly, we should be able to come up with a flexible enough, sounds like an oxymoron, a flexible enough legislation that can deal with the type of risks that we currently see. Legal certainty. We want to make sure, and we have all the time, a lot of the entities, the new entities, the innovative entities, they come to us and they want to know what is it that we need to do in order to be regulated. And one of the challenges that we have, which I will also speak about later, is we also need that type of infrastructure internally, the capacity, the technical capacity, as well as the human capacity, to be able to understand what sort of risks are being posed by these new entities, which sometimes, as a regulator, we're not able to properly understand. And that's where sometimes the sandbox becomes that opportunity for us to properly understand what it is that they're doing. And obviously, we want to make sure it is an efficient piece of legislation. It adds some efficiency in order to, and that goes along with the flexibility in order to make sure that it comes at the right time right pace and the right amount of weight of the law. So these are the key things which I think should go into any piece of legislation. Of course, we sometimes don't have that flexibility because a lot of the current laws are set for bricks and mortar. They don't contemplate this type of innovation. And so that's the challenge. If we're able to have legislation that allows for this sort of flexibility, but it requires a framework. And so in order for that to operate properly, we need to have the framework properly understood and implemented and followed so that we could meet all of these various innovative elements. And it will change all the time, it will change. So we need to think about how we will structure the legislation to allow for that flexibility outside of sunset-based legislation or sunset-type legislation.
And just before I go to John, I mean, just on the back of that, because that's one of the points I'm throwing around in my head is, do we just need a different environment for digital that allows for more dialogue on a constant rolling basis, more dynamic environment between regulators, government and industry? Or do we still follow the traditional processes?
Yes, I'll give way as well. But yes, I think we need to have that type of dialogue. But of course, it requires, again, coming back to frameworks, coming back to the capacity, coming back to these things to make sure that everyone is stepping on the same page or moving lockstep. And it don't always happen that way. So that's one of the challenges that we currently face. I think that the sandbox idea works, but again, you need to have the parameters around the sandbox type idea to make sure that everyone understands why we have it and how it will function most effectively. So that's a start in order to get that sort of collaboration, but it is not the end all and be all, because you still have, outside of that, you still have the legislative process to follow.
Which in itself can take a long time as well, right?
Correct.
John, I mean, the companies and the organizations and stakeholders you engage with, if there's sort of two things that they ask for or two barriers that they come against all the time that you hear about the most, what are they?
No, I think you guys kind of set it up very nicely for me, because exactly that conversation you were having was the sort of problem statement and the hypothesis that led us to basically start an initiative which we will be launching at the end of June within Trinidad and Tobago in terms of Fintech Innovation Hub. Because exactly what Mr. Ward was describing there, particularly, when you look at the rules of engagement and things are changing so quickly, and regulatory certainty is something, again, that is always required, but there's so much energy and there's so much investment and excitement around this sector, right? I could imagine it is probably occupying majority of central bankers' times going forward, right? And, even coming back to your question in terms of some of the queries that we get, right? We realize that you have a lot of people who have ideas, right? And they're observing externally and they're seeing opportunities where they could play a role and provide a solution, but they don't quite understand themselves, the parameters, even if they require regulatory supervision then, based on what they are looking to do. And we realize that whole education aspect and helping to even refine their business models and even understanding what they want to do and even providing what I would call sort of pre-guidance before the sandbox stage. Because I'm sure Mr. Ward could probably attest, because we hear about it even in our jurisdiction. You have a lot of people approaching the regulators without even knowing if what they're proposing needs to be regulated. It's a lot of ideas, it's a lot of ideation, but it's not yet a real company, right? It's not yet proven, it's still at the proof of concept prototyping phase. So this is why we saw the need to kind of make that investment, and we are partnering with the United Nations Capital Development Fund. Helen, I think she's still on the call, to really provide that facility and that service to help fintechs understand exactly what are you trying to do, what are you trying to achieve, who you are trying to address and to kind of streamline that sort of process. So if I had to answer, the two things that we hear about is, one, we would like to understand how can we do business in Trinidad and Tobago. And from that, I think every fintech doesn't want to do business in one island, right? Everybody has a pan-Caribbean vision. Because when you look at the Caribbean, on the English-speaking side, we're talking about 6 million people, right? The Caribbean itself is a very, very small market, but it's a very, very important, what I would call proven ground for fintech, not just in the region, but for companies external, because you have a lot of new solutions. The established markets are very saturated. The entire industry is looking for what I call emerging economies, where they could plug in their solutions, get their proof of concepts, and then that allows them to sort of scale outward. So the two things that we constantly hear is, obviously trying to figure out whether they need to be regulated or not be regulated, and then understanding what I would call the regional ecosystem. Then how do they plug in? What's the situation with the banks? What's happening in the payment systems? Is there talent on the ground? Is there other fintechs that we can talk to? So this is why we're trying to sort of bring those three components together in a hub: that network effect, access to talent, and then obviously the understanding in terms of how we should operate, or even, which bucket you should fit into.
Yeah, so it's a really good point that around industry can be very inarticulate at times, can't it, in terms of wanting to do something but not being very articulate about what it is that it's asking, which makes it very difficult from a government point of view or an agency point of view to solve. Just a lot of the problems we talk about around fintechs, the market itself, whether it's dealing with fraud, whether it's dealing with AML, KYC bureaucracy, digital identity adoption, fintech partnerships with banks. There's an endless long list of opportunities, but a lot of it actually is nothing to do with government. It's got to do with industry leadership, and the industry itself can solve a lot of these problems, albeit with some support from an enabling legal policy framework. How much would you like to see the industry take the lead more, or do you think are they waiting for you and you're waiting for them? Is this a chicken and an egg?
Yeah, it's always a chicken and an egg question. But I think I don't think the industry they're actually waiting for us. And I'm happy when we see a proof of concept come to us. It is the ones where there isn't a proof of concept and they don't come to us that we tend to get very worried about. Because if they come to us, it means that they want to be regulated, and there's a degree of credibility that they will see as part of being regulated. So again, I think the industry themselves, they're interested in making sure on a general scale that they're on the right path. So I don't think the issue is one or the other. What needs to happen is everyone to sit together and understand, what it is that the regulator is responsible for and what they're trying to do and trying to achieve. And also from the industry side, we understand that, there are significant benefits to be had from these innovative concepts. But sometimes the complexity of the activity itself lends to challenges which the industry themselves are not fully aware of, in terms of the impact that it can have. A lot of the risks that we see are not old risks. They're simply the mode at which they occur is different. But you still have the same issues: operational risks, governance challenges, credit risk, privacy. These are always available, are always the risks that you will see under any type of system, even bricks and mortar banking. It's just how it is done and the mode at which it impacts on the same individuals that we're looking to help in the financial inclusion, as well as they might have a knock-on effect for the system. So that is really what we like to have a handle on early before we release this type of industries into the full market.
John, if I can come to you, you've got a room full of people across this amazing Commonwealth set of nations that we're all part of. If there's one thing that you think we should all go away with, what would that be?
If I had to give one thing to sort of go with, and you're right, the Commonwealth has done an excellent job. Even last year, when they presented their Fintech toolkit, and we facilitated a session here in Trinidad and Tobago with regulators, governments, private sector in the room. I recognize, and I think I saw it in the chat here, that there's a lot of new terminology. There's a lot of new models. This is definitely, the ground is still moving here in Fintech. And it's not something I would like to leave with, but I think it's something that I would like to encourage more of in terms of dialogues around what I call this financial inclusion challenge that we are having. I think Fintech is absolutely a subset of it, but I think financial inclusion and sort of having more conversations at a regional level and understanding and as I said, even at a Commonwealth level, right? Because again, when you look at India and what India is experiencing and what they have gone through, it largely resembles a lot of what you see happening in the region. That's obviously at scale, right? So I do think the Commonwealth has the ability to really sort of share in those experiences and really help put these financial inclusion programs, taking those lessons learned. But I think my sort of ask is not necessarily a takeaway, is that we definitely need, I would like to see more discussions and more support forthcoming, particularly within the region in terms of dealing with those challenges. I think that's a gap, and I think that is a tide I think will lift all boats, even as we relate to Fintech and the whole digital transformation of government, etc.
And what about you, Warrick, in terms of the sort of Commonwealth collaboration? We're seeing some fantastic examples coming out of India and Singapore, aren't we, at the moment, particularly, but all over the Commonwealth, there's lots of innovation going on. What would you say would be the thing we should take away with, what's the call to action?
Yeah, I would just say ditto. I think we need to collaborate more. We need to have more and more regular meaty discussion with regards to where we're going, sort of like a roadmap. I know there isn't what we can say right now as an end point, but we need to have more of a roadmap as to where we expect to go and the milestones along which where we expect to go in the future. One of the things that we have at the within the FSCs is the Fintech Advisory Committee, which is made up of industry, trade, regulators, and they sort of advise us with regards to new techniques, new initiatives, new things that are happening within the Fintech space. And this sort of collaboration will help us or guide us in terms of what type of regulation we are providing to the industry. So I think that's in essence what we're looking for.
Brilliant. Well, roadmaps and more collaboration.
If it's possible, could we move towards some questions from the audience?
Sure. Yeah, and then questions and answers. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, we can go straight to Q&A now if you want. Yeah.
And we also have.
So we do have a question that we received online. 1 second. What role does the TTRFC aim to play with regard to supporting the enabling legal and regulatory environment to enable fintechs to thrive? And do you plan on working with regulators together to foster that ecosystem?
Sure. And I think the term that we are ideating in our head is really around capacity building. Because as Mr. Watts was saying, right, there's a lot of new terminology. The problems are the same, it's just coming in different wrappers, right? And obviously having even locally here with our own central bank, how does the TTRC play a role in terms of where we see ourselves as that sort of public-private entity that can understand these challenges, understand these entities, and work with our joint regulatory bodies in terms of capacity building and helping them understand and assess these business models and these entities and the technology. So that's definitely where we see ourselves sort of playing a role, because, as when we talk about even RegTech and SupTech, which is a new sort of category of fintech where you see not necessarily playing a role on the external side, but basically being fintech for the regulatory environment, right? I think that is something, that I think is going to be a little more pervasive in the region when you speak to the banks and so forth, encouraging that sort of adoption. So, that is where we want to aim to play our role in terms of that capacity building.
Spaces, not just fintech, but things like LEO satellites and so on, because they don't fit neatly into existing regulatory frameworks. And even to simply get a response sometimes in writing from regulators is frustrating. And therefore, we are talking about building digital economies, but at the same time frustrating companies that are ready, willing, and able to invest and provide solutions in the market. So Felicity, I don't know if you want to share your experience in moving, and this is a well-established technology in Africa, and Africa has been one of the leading continents in the world in terms of fintech. So to really bring that technology here to the Caribbean, it is unfortunate some of the frustrations that you and other companies have been facing. So would you like to speak to that, please? Felicity, did you hear the question? Can you hear us? And if not, maybe one of the other panelists could speak, even though maybe not about Zeemoney's experience, but perhaps about other companies that have been trying to establish in the region. Mr. Ward, would you like to speak to that? I think Zeemoney is actually operating here in Barbados, but not necessarily about the company itself, but about sort of the regulations and why are some of these companies meeting brick walls, basically.
Yeah. Felicity is speaking.
Can you hear us, Felicity?
Felicity, can you hear us?
I think she keeps
Evidently not.
freezing, I think.
Now, hello?
Yes, sir.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello?
Would you like to go right ahead with your response?
I did not hear most of the question. If you can just repeat it for my benefit.
No, I just basically wanted, in summary, to tell us about your experience in establishing your company here in Barbados and the rest of the Caribbean markets.
Okay, thank you, and apologies to everyone. I had some challenges joining virtually. It's been an experience, I would say, for us. Different from other markets. The Caribbean has been, the experience in the Caribbean has been quite different from other markets our business has expanded into. Of course, there's a regular regulation often have to have. I think that has to be the same across the globe, so across the markets that we've gone into, have been the constant engagement with the regulator to get them to understand our business goal and our operation as a fit. I'm sorry, I'm turning off my video so that my audio can sound better. Please pardon me. So I find that it takes a lot of engagement and deep diving with the regulator to be able to explain clearly and to the very tiny, minute detail, exactly as a fintech, what platforms you're going to be running, how exactly you're going to operate, in order for the regulator to have appreciation for our kind of business. In Barbados, considering that there's been no business like ours, it's taken a lot of time to go through these engagements and reach a place where we're licensed to come into the market and set up. The next level on that is to be able to start engaging customers to understand what kind of a service that a fintech is going to provide. Because what the everyday person is used to is a bank. What you're going to do, the questions that keep coming up, both with customers, even banks and other B2Bs, it's what exactly is your business? What are you operating? Are you a bank? Are you not a bank? Now, that is the one question that fintechs who engage in payments could answer. That is the prime question that you face in the markets, especially in markets that are quite new to the industry. So the question has always been, are you a bank? And then the other thing also is that you find that existing regulation and existing practices, because they've been built and developed around banks, you have to work twice as hard to manage. You have to work twice as hard to be able to start to get the regulator to appreciate your business, and so that even your reporting, the formats in which you handle your reporting, can be very specific to your business. Otherwise, in the beginning, it's all tailored to the traditional banking model. That has been our experience so far. I'm not sure if anyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah, we can hear you. We've just been given a 4 or 5 minute notice just to start wrapping up. It's great to have you with us, Felicity, and I hope you can hear us talking from this end as well. Warrick, perhaps if I can come to you. Do you want to just try and I think the gist of that was it's pretty hard to engage with regulators. I mean, I'd certainly from the UK side have heard the similar sorts of things, but although I would couch it sometimes as to what's the expectation to, organisations like ours sort of get caught a little bit in between these two worlds. So, but I mean, from your point of view, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a number of challenges. One, obviously, if it is a new product that's being entered into the market, we would want to engage with any new supplier of these services to make sure that we properly understand the risk, and we properly want to understand whether you have the mitigating things in place to make sure that this risk doesn't spill over into the market. A lot of the times as well, to what you will find, and I mentioned it before, is that there isn't capacity, especially if you're talking things like triple entry for like the blockchain, these types of new technologies coming into fore. There isn't the capacity within the framework of the regulatory space to properly deal with this type of new institution right off the bat. And so it would require a longer space in terms of the engagement as opposed to if it was, say, a bricks and mortar bank. The other challenge is that we have to fit these entities within current legislation. So we can't give licenses or we can't give approvals to things outside of the space of the legislation. So then you have to think of what type of solution will be legislative solutions that will be required for this type of entity, whether this is something that can fit into that bucket. And often we are not able to do it. And so you might have a longer lead time for this type of activity before we find a solution.
Yeah, I think it comes back to a point we were discussing earlier around the need for dialogue, doesn't it? I think when there's a need for governments to change regulation and laws, then obviously there's an enormous delay when actually businesses are just trying to get off the ground and trying to bring opportunities into the market. From my perspective, and I come with a business perspective here, is that element of dialogue. But to the capacity issue, this is one of the areas I think where the Commonwealth and other regional and grouping entities can actually really help. I hear capacity raised all the time. Everywhere I go in the world, there's a capacity gap of some shape or form. It's not in any particular area of the world. I think, especially around the area of technology and finance, there's just a lack of capacity and skills right across the board. And that's where I think, the more scope for collaboration through networks like the Commonwealth. I actually think the Commonwealth has got an enormous USP here because of our shared legal kind of frameworks. There is a commonality there, which other global networks just don't have. You've got to go country by country. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Whereas the Commonwealth, you can work in one group and you've got a shared basis of understanding, knowledge, and legal framework to accelerate solutions where others can't. So I think I'm not going to get in the way of your lunch. I'm more conscious that lunch is next. We've had some technological difficulties on this panel. We've got Felicity there for a couple of minutes, but not long enough, unfortunately, because I think she would have brought an interesting B2C perspective to this conversation. But I hope you found this an insightful conversation. Thank you to my two great speakers. I mean, you couldn't get two better speakers than John and Warrick. I'm very honored to sit here with both of them. And it's a great honor to sit here with all of you and all of those online as well. And I hope this has been a useful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.